Welcome to Creepy Shadow Stories. Today we're opening a new episode where each of you will face an incomprehensible horror. There are places in the wilderness of North America where you should never go. Places where silence is the most terrifying sound, and the shadows hide something that hunts not only game, but people too. In these stories, we'll travel to isolated corners like the Flathead National Forest to hear the accounts of those who survived an encounter with it. They saw tracks that don't belong to any known animal. They found remains left by no ordinary predator. They witnessed entire lives disappear without a trace. Their stories aren't just scary tales. They are psychological scars that have changed them forever. They know that something ancient, malevolent, and incredibly intelligent is hiding in these woods. Are you ready to look into this darkness with us? Well then, let's begin. Story 1. I volunteered for this, I kept reminding myself as Marcus and I made our way through the tangled fallen trees that littered the trail. We had just graduated from SUNY College of Environmental Science and Forestry. We were trained to understand these woods better than anyone, and were eager for hands-on experience. But enthusiasm quickly fades when reality hits you like a punch to the gut. The Five Ponds Wilderness had a dark reputation among the older forest rangers stationed in Wanakina and Cranberry Lake. I had seen the knowing looks they exchanged when Marcus and I signed up for the inspection. Bear Mountain's abandoned lookout tower and its worn-down cabin were now little more than scribbles on old maps. It was a forgotten place buried by time and snow. Locals said that in winter, when heavy snow blanketed the Adirondacks, something screamed through the woods, the sound echoing down the empty valleys. The stories seemed foolish in the daylight, but as the light faded and the trail disappeared, foolishness became easier to believe. "Tyler, hold up," Marcus said from behind me, breathing heavily. He was red-faced, panting clouds into the frigid air. "This trail sucks." "Tell me something I don't know," I said, forcing a laugh. My own breath fogged my glasses, blurring the already indistinct path ahead. "We have to be close." We pushed on, the snow deepening underfoot, hiding slick roots and jagged rocks. Every few steps, branches whipped at our faces, stinging our skin. It felt as though the forest itself was resisting our approach. By late afternoon, as the last faint glow of light slipped below the treetops, we finally spotted the tower. The rusted metal framework loomed above us, skeletal and twisted, as if years of harsh winters had bent it toward surrender. Beneath the tower was the cabin, an old log shelter covered in thick layers of moss and ice. One wall sagged inward and another wore a blanket of fresh frost. No fire had warmed it in decades. "Home, sweet home," Marcus muttered, slinging off his pack. I forced open the swollen cabin door. Inside, the air tasted stale and musty. We shuffled in, kicking snow from our boots, our eyes adjusting to the gloomy interior. A rust-stained stove sat against the far wall, its pipe disconnected. The bunk beds were warped, the wood gray with age. Marcus flicked his flashlight toward the lower bunk, pausing suddenly. "Look at this," he said quietly. Beneath the bunk, deep scratches marred the floorboards. They were long gouges, as if something had desperately clawed its way through solid wood. Behind the stove, a dark, dry, and flaky stain smeared upward. Marcus knelt, squinting. "Is that blood?" "Probably animal blood," I said, though I could hear the unease in my own voice. "Bear, raccoon, something nesting here." "Yeah," Marcus agreed quietly, but neither of us moved. Our words hung limp between us. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the cabin's brittle walls. A gust shrieked briefly, through the cracks, echoing weirdly off the metal tower above. Marcus laughed nervously, standing quickly. We unpacked silently, setting up our sleeping bags and laying out our gear. We attempted the satellite phone several times, but it was useless, blocked by thick pines and shadowed peaks. Snow started falling again, slow flakes drifting lazily through the fading evening. "I'll check outside," Marcus said abruptly, sounding overly cheerful. I knew him well enough to understand he was trying to shake off the tension building inside this cramped, darkening shelter. "Be quick," I nodded. He stepped outside, the door closing heavily behind him, muffling the growing wind. I stood alone in the silence, rubbing my chilled hands, staring again at the claw marks beneath the bed. They were deep, frantic slashes that seemed to scream out a story I desperately did not want to know. Then I heard it. A distant sound filtering through the trees. It wasn't wind. This was different, something alive. Something between a howl and a scream, impossibly distant yet piercingly clear. My blood ran cold. The door swung open abruptly, revealing Marcus's pale and drawn face. "Did you hear that?" he asked breathlessly. "Yeah," I said, my throat tight. "What was it?" Marcus shook his head slowly, his gaze locked on the swirling snow behind him. "Nothing," he said finally, his voice hollow. "Nothing at all." The words sounded empty even to him, but neither of us argued. We simply closed the door, locked it tight, and sat in silence, listening to the wind rise and fall, pretending that whatever we had heard was gone. Outside, darkness settled over Bear Mountain, burying the abandoned station beneath a thickening blanket of white. When I woke up, Marcus was gone. My eyes struggled open to the gray, frigid daylight seeping through gaps in the old cabin walls. I sat upright, immediately feeling the chill. Something was wrong. Deeply wrong. Marcus's sleeping bag was ripped wide open, the torn fabric spilling across the floor. His boots still stood by the stove exactly where he'd left them. His jacket hung untouched on a rusty hook by the door. "Marcus," my voice echoed hollowly against the cold logs, unanswered. I climbed out of my sleeping bag, my heart thumping. Ice-cold boards numbed my feet as I quickly dressed, pulling on my boots, gloves, and coat. I moved toward the door, bracing myself. Maybe he'd stepped outside for firewood or to relieve himself. Maybe I was panicking over nothing. I pushed the cabin door open and my stomach dropped. Outside, the snow lay perfectly smooth and undisturbed. No tracks led from the cabin, no sign that Marcus had ever left. The air was silent and utterly still. It was a strange kind of silence, thick enough that it seemed to press against my ears. "Marcus!" I shouted louder this time. My voice carried, bouncing between snow-heavy branches. Nothing answered but the quiet rustle of my own breathing. I circled the cabin carefully, checking every side for footprints. Nothing. The snow was unbroken and pristine, as if he'd simply vanished from existence. My hands shook as I scanned the tree line, desperate for movement. A flash of color, anything that might signal Marcus. There was only emptiness. Desperation grew sharper in my chest. I grabbed our satellite phone again, fumbling with numb fingers. No signal. The screen mocked me, dead and useless. Helplessness quickly turned to anger, then back to fear. My mind raced. Marcus couldn't have gone far barefoot, could he? The idea was absurd. I climbed the lookout tower, hoping for a better view. I gripped each icy rung, my gloves sliding dangerously. Wind bit at my face, cold and relentless, making my eyes water as I reached the top. But looking out over the endless snow-covered forest, I saw no movement, no trace. Only gray and white, stretching forever beneath clouds heavy with another storm. A sudden wave of dizziness forced me back down the ladder. Back on solid ground, I leaned against the cabin wall, breathing heavily, my eyes tightly shut. Calm down, I thought. Think. Marcus was smart, resourceful. Maybe he'd heard something and went to investigate. Maybe he'd become disoriented, but barefoot without his coat. The afternoon dragged on as I forced myself to expand my search, shouting his name until my throat burned. The temperature continued dropping, the air sharpening painfully with cold. Panic clawed at my chest. If I didn't find him soon, he'd never survive the night out here. By the time dusk began draining color from the sky, exhaustion forced me back to the cabin. I barricaded the door using the old bunk frames and the remains of furniture inside. As darkness fell completely, I lit the stove with our dwindling supply of kindling. Shadows danced wildly against the walls, deepening the cracks and gouges in the wood. Those gouges drew my attention again. I knelt, studying the floor closely. Something about the scratches felt intentional, urgent. One set of marks was deeper than the others, carving almost completely through the board, as if something had desperately tried to break free or reach something buried beneath. A noise outside snapped my head upward. Thump, heavy, slow. Thump, thump. My heart hammered painfully. I turned off my headlamp, sitting absolutely still, listening. The sound circled the cabin, measured steps crunching through the snow. Whatever was out there wasn't trying to hide its presence. I gripped the handle of the old Forest Service hatchet we'd brought along, my knuckles aching. The thumping paused briefly and I held my breath, every muscle locked rigidly. After several unbearable minutes of silence, I slowly exhaled, thinking whatever it was had moved away. Then, with a force that shook the entire cabin, something slammed hard against the outer wall directly behind my head. I bit my tongue, suppressing a scream. Another slam followed, then another, rattling the timbers. Each impact sent shockwaves of terror through my chest. I squeezed my eyes shut, unable to move, unable to think clearly. The assault continued for minutes that felt like hours, and then abruptly it stopped. The cabin went silent again. Only my shallow, ragged breathing broke the quiet. I sat frozen, staring at nothing as dawn finally crept through the boarded windows. Slowly I stood, my joints stiff from fear and cold. My hands shaking violently, I pried the barricade away from the door and opened it, peering out into the pale morning light. The snow lay untouched, utterly smooth and unmarked. No footprints, no sign of anything living having been there at all. I stepped outside, feeling disconnected and numb. Movement at the top of the tower drew my gaze upward. There, fluttering softly, caught in a rusted support beam, was a scrap of fabric. Marcus's parka, ripped and dangling like a macabre flag. Its torn edges were stained, dark red, and clinging to one corner was a single coarse strand of gray hair. I stared upward, a fresh wave of nausea rising inside me. Marcus hadn't vanished. He'd been taken. I had to get out. After finding Marcus's torn parka, something shifted inside me. Panic gave way to a cold, numbing certainty. If I stayed another night in this place, I would disappear too. I spent the morning dismantling the bunk beds, prying the ancient boards apart. My hands, already raw from the cold, splintered and bled as I fashioned a crude sled. Tent poles provided bindings and a frame. Twine and rope lashed tightly around the warped wood. The final product was ugly and uncertain, but it was my only hope. The snow was waist-deep and soft, and I'd never make it back without something to carry my gear. Around midday, I shouldered my pack, secured the sled, and started back down the trail. Or what I hoped was the trail. With each step, my legs sank heavily into the snow. My breath came raggedly, misting in clouds around me. The path forward felt endless, swallowed by white drifts that blurred into featureless woods. As darkness crept closer, I gathered branches and pine needles, digging a shallow depression beneath the shelter of a fallen tree. I lit a small fire with shaking hands and one precious flare, warming my numb fingers and fighting exhaustion. The smoke rose straight into the empty blackness overhead. That night, lying half buried in snow and hidden by my makeshift camp, I listened. Silence, then footsteps steady. Something was moving nearby, just beyond my circle of firelight. I curled tighter into myself, gripping my hatchet hard enough to bruise my palm. The steps circled slowly, methodically. They drew close enough that I could hear snow crunching beneath a heavy weight. Yet I saw nothing. No figure, no shadow, only the oppressive darkness. It stopped again, lingering, waiting. I didn't sleep. I didn't move. Eventually, the footsteps faded into the distance, leaving only the faint crackling of my fire and my own shallow breathing. Morning came slowly, the sky a dull, oppressive gray. My eyes burned from exhaustion as I stood surveying the untouched snow around my camp. No tracks, no proof anything had been there. Yet I knew better. I trudged onward, pulling the sled, every muscle aching from cold and fatigue. My vision blurred at the edges, shapes shifting between the trees. Hallucinations began. Shadows took form, dancing figures of smoke and snow flickering just beyond my focus. Each time I turned my head, they dissolved. That afternoon, movement among the trees stopped me cold. Partly obscured by branches stood a figure, human-shaped but far too tall, thin and ragged with unnaturally long limbs. It remained motionless, watching. I felt its attention like a physical weight, suffocating, freezing me in place. My heartbeat pounded loudly, the only sound in a suddenly airless forest. I forced myself to look away, staring down at my boots, counting my breaths. When I dared to look up again, the figure had vanished into the pale emptiness. I continued forward, my legs barely cooperating, each step slower, heavier. By nightfall, my strength was gone. Shivering violently, I huddled beneath an evergreen, too weak to build a fire, too numb to care. My thoughts spiraled inward, fading into incoherent murmurs. I woke sometime deep in the night to a voice calling my name. Tyler. It sounded close, clear, not whispered, but spoken plainly without warmth or breath behind it. And though every instinct screamed at me not to, I raised my head toward the sound. Marcus stood there, illuminated dimly by reflected moonlight. He waved gently, smiling as if nothing were wrong. Marcus! My voice cracked painfully, but something was off. His face was wrong, thin and stretched, his eyes hollow and dark. When his smile widened, I saw teeth that did not belong, sharp and uneven. I staggered upright, terror flooding me with adrenaline. Marcus's figure shifted, suddenly blurring into darkness, becoming tall and twisted, limbs too thin, too long. It advanced slowly, silently through the snow. A scream lodged in my throat. I turned and fled blindly through the trees, my lungs burning, tears freezing on my cheeks. I ran until my legs collapsed beneath me, until my chest heaved so painfully I thought I would die. I crawled forward, my mind slipping further into delirium. All around me, shapes shifted, whispered my name, and beckoned from the shadows. I squeezed my eyes shut, crawling forward inch by inch, my world reduced to numbness and fear. When I awoke again, a bright light blinded me. Voices shouted, human voices, hands lifted me onto something loud and mechanical. Snowmobiles, rescuers from Cranberry Lake, bundled heavily, speaking urgently. Their words came muffled and distant, relief mingled with confusion, but my strength was gone. Days later, I found myself in a hospital bed. Doctors and nurses moved silently around me, careful and gentle, never asking too much. They whispered about hypothermia, frostbite, and dehydration, but avoided mentioning Marcus. I refused to speak, my tongue too heavy, the memories too raw. I stared blankly at the ceiling, waiting for the numbness inside to fade. But it lingered, relentless. And in the emptiness, I heard Marcus's voice again and again. One night, as a nurse gently adjusted my IV, I finally forced words out, speaking softly, flatly, without looking at her. "It wasn't hungry," I whispered. "It was lonely." She froze briefly, then continued her work in silence. I didn't explain, knowing somehow she understood. People around here knew. They'd always known, even if they never spoke of it. I turned away, closing my eyes again, trying to push away the memories of Marcus's empty smile beneath the endless snow and dark trees. Story 2. I hadn't spent much time with my dad since my mom died. Truthfully, I hadn't spent much time with him before that either. Cal Morgan was the kind of father you admired from a distance, and that distance usually felt like the span of a continent. He spent most of my childhood overseas, a career Army Ranger known for his ability to survive in conditions most people wouldn't willingly visit. When he finally retired, he didn't settle down. He chose instead to teach wilderness navigation and survival. My mother loved him, though I'm not sure she ever fully understood him. After she passed, we became two people orbiting a painful silence. When he suggested a week-long trek through Wyoming's Wind River Range, I almost said no. But something in his voice, a gentle vulnerability I hadn't heard before, pushed me to agree. I flew in from Seattle, met him in Riverton, and we drove out to the Elkhart Park trailhead on a cold September morning. The leaves had already turned a brittle yellow, and a ranger stopped us briefly before we headed out, warning us of bear sightings and an early snowfall. Neither seemed to bother Dad. The first couple of days went by without issue, aside from my growing irritation with the terrain and weather. By day 3, we'd crossed Island Lake and were making our way toward Bonneville Basin. My muscles ached, and the straps of my pack chafed my shoulders, but I kept pace with my father. He moved ahead of me with practiced ease, constantly scanning the horizon as if expecting trouble. It was almost noon when Dad paused on the trail, staring intently into a stand of lodgepole pines. "Hold up," he said quietly. "What is it?" "Game trail. Curious where it leads." I sighed loudly enough for him to hear, but he ignored it and stepped off the main path. The trail he chose was barely more than a hint of disturbed grass, winding through a grove so dense that branches scratched at our jackets. I swallowed my complaints, following closely behind. Less than a quarter mile later, we found it. My stomach twisted into a tight knot. There, tucked against a rocky slope beneath twisted, dying pines, stood a crude shelter. The walls were built from elk antlers, cracked bones, and rotting wood. Every piece was weathered by exposure. It looked like something built by someone desperate or insane. It was a heap of sharp angles and organic debris. My eyes trailed across the twisted shapes, and nausea rose in my throat as I realized many of the bones had been gnawed. "Dad," my voice barely carried above a whisper. He didn't respond. Instead, he knelt and ran his fingers slowly over one of the wooden support beams. Then he abruptly recoiled, his eyes narrowing. I stepped closer, feeling the chill seep through my coat. Embedded in the grain of the weathered wood were teeth, human teeth, ivory white to yellowed, with roots intact, forced deep into the timber. I could feel my pulse quicken, and my breath fogged in short bursts. "Dad, we shouldn't be here." He nodded, his eyes darkening. Without another word, he turned away and walked back the way we'd come, faster than before. I hurried after him, glancing back only once at the terrible shelter. It seemed to mock our intrusion, a dark, jagged shape standing stark against the thin forest. We hiked another mile down a steep slope toward a rushing glacial stream before Dad finally stopped. We set up camp in silence, working quickly as dusk seeped across the landscape. Dad spoke little, only giving brief instructions. His eyes seemed focused on something far away, something only he could see. Nightfall came rapidly, bringing with it a bitter wind. I zipped myself into the tent and stared at the thin nylon walls, listening to the stream hiss and churn nearby. Sleep came in restless fits, and it felt like only moments passed before a sound woke me. Crunch, crunch. I sat upright, my pulse pounding in my ears. The sound came again, slow and deliberate, like footsteps circling above our camp. I turned toward Dad. He was already awake, his eyes fixed on the darkness beyond the tent. He lifted a finger to his lips and shook his head slowly. Crunch. Snap. Whatever it was, it circled us twice before moving away. When silence finally returned, neither of us moved, waiting desperately for dawn. The morning light brought relief, but also dread. Our camp looked different. Small things, scattered items, had been shifted subtly from where we'd left them. Dad stood at the edge of our clearing, his posture stiff. I approached quietly, then followed his gaze down to the ground. Resting on a flat rock placed there intentionally was a pair of military-issued jungle boots. Worn down and split at the soles, they looked as though they'd spent years in these mountains. Dad knelt slowly, staring at them. His face was pale. "What is it?" I asked, though part of me didn't want the answer. He exhaled slowly, his voice tight. "These belonged to someone I knew, Sergeant Bill Navarro. He disappeared up here maybe 6 years back. They never found him." The silence that followed was heavier than any we'd shared before. I stared at those boots, trying to ignore the way the wind now felt colder, the trees more oppressive. "Dad," I finally whispered, "I think someone wants us gone." His eyes met mine, colder and more haunted than I'd ever seen them. "No, Rachel," he said. "I think someone wants us to stay." My father didn't speak again until mid-morning. We sat quietly by the small fire he'd built, sipping bitter coffee. My nerves felt frayed from lack of sleep and the creeping unease that had taken hold. I stared into the smoldering embers, hoping he'd break the silence first. Finally, he spoke, his voice heavy with something I couldn't quite identify. "Rachel, about those boots." I glanced up. He was looking directly at me, his expression tense, the lines on his face deeper than I remembered. "They were Bill Navarro's," he continued, his voice hushed as if even the trees might overhear. "He disappeared hiking solo up here back in 2019. No traces, no leads, nothing. Search and rescue teams combed these mountains for weeks. I knew Bill well enough to recognize those boots anywhere." "How can you be sure?" My question felt foolish even as I said it. "The laces," he said softly. "Bill always used red paracord. It was his way of being prepared. I taught him that." I swallowed hard, feeling the forest around us tighten like a snare. "Maybe someone found them," I offered. "Maybe it's a coincidence." He shook his head slowly. "I don't think so," he said. "Whatever we stumbled into here, it's not random." The silence fell between us again, oppressive. We broke camp in tense quiet, packing swiftly. Every sound felt louder, the crunch of pine needles beneath our boots, the rustling of our gear, our breaths sharp and shallow. The weight of our packs grew heavier as if the air itself resisted our movement. By midday, we'd moved a few miles south along the trail. I tried to focus on the terrain, the vast granite faces, the sharp contrast of alpine grass against patches of snow, but my eyes kept drifting back up the ridge toward the shelter we'd left behind. Then around mid-afternoon, Dad stopped abruptly and pointed into the distance. A thin ribbon of smoke curled upward against a pale, cloudy sky somewhere near the ridge we'd left earlier. It rose and dissipated gently, far too controlled to be accidental, yet oddly faint, barely visible. "Is someone camping up there?" I asked, though I doubted my own suggestion. "Too remote," Dad murmured, his eyes narrowed. "Not a good spot, no water source nearby." We watched it silently for another few minutes. Eventually, the smoke faded entirely, leaving no trace it had ever existed. Dad's jaw tightened. "Let's keep moving." Evening descended quickly, blanketing the valley in shades of gray and blue. Dad chose a new campsite cautiously, selecting an open area with good visibility. We built a larger fire this time, arranging rocks carefully around its perimeter. He retrieved a hatchet and a flare gun from his pack, placing both within easy reach. His preparation only heightened my anxiety. We barely spoke through dinner, our ears straining to pick up anything unusual. Just as the shadows deepened, I moved down a shallow slope to gather water from a stream. My breath caught when something shifted in my peripheral vision. I froze, slowly raising my eyes toward the ridge above us. A figure stood outlined against the fading twilight, tall, gaunt, and angular. Its form was distorted by the dimness, but it was clearly not an animal. Its arms hung unnaturally long at its sides, its torso impossibly thin. I stood paralyzed, my heart hammering in my chest. "Dad," I whispered urgently, barely audible. Up on the ridge, he appeared next to me, following my gaze upward, but the figure was already gone. Only empty space remained, framed by rocks and pines. A deep chill settled into my bones. "I saw it," I insisted softly, fighting back the tremor in my voice. "Someone was watching us." He nodded gravely. "I believe you." We hurried back to camp, building the fire higher, feeding it dry wood until flames leaped and crackled. I pulled my jacket tightly around my shoulders, scanning the dark edges of our campsite. As night fell fully, dread pressed in around us, heavy and tangible. Then we heard it. Footsteps again, slow and deliberate, circling just beyond the fire's glow. Dad gripped the hatchet tightly, his jaw clenched. The steps moved with precision, pausing occasionally as if measuring our reactions. We sat frozen, listening, barely breathing. Suddenly, something landed near the fire, making me jump. I stared in horror as Dad leaned forward, lifting the object from the ground. His fingers trembled slightly as he held it up to the firelight, an army patch. His face drained of color as he turned it over. He traced the emblem gently with his thumb, his breathing ragged, his eyes glassy with emotion. "This is from my old unit," he whispered. His voice cracked on the words, grief and confusion spilling from him openly for the first time in my life. This belonged to one of the others," he said. "One of the missing." "How many went missing, Dad?" He exhaled deeply, fighting back visible pain. Four soldiers from my unit vanished up here between 2009 and 2018. Always alone, always without a trace. I felt tears stinging my eyes, the reality of our situation hitting me with terrifying clarity. "Something followed us from that shelter," I said. "Something that knows you." Before he could respond, a new sound froze us both. Directly behind the tent, close enough to touch the thin nylon walls, came deep, rhythmic breathing. It sounded wet and heavy, inhaling long and slow as if taking us in, savoring our presence. Dad lifted his finger silently, his eyes locked on mine, shaking his head once. Neither of us dared to move, barely breathing ourselves. We waited, our muscles taut, our minds frantically searching for escape, until eventually the sound stopped. But the silence that replaced it was infinitely worse. When everything essential was secured, Dad reached into his pack and pulled out a small canister of kerosene, one he'd carried for emergencies. In swift, practiced motions, he began rigging a crude tripwire between two narrow trees near our campsite's edge. He laid fishing line at ankle height, barely visible, securing it tightly between two sticks that supported the canister above a small, prepared mound of tinder. "What's this?" I whispered sharply, confused. "A warning or distraction," he said, his tone flat and resolute. "When this trips, it'll flash up quick. If something's following us, we'll have a few seconds." I swallowed hard, realizing this wasn't just caution. He was setting a trap. Whatever stalked us wasn't just some wild animal. It was something else entirely, something calculated. We extinguished most of our fire, leaving just glowing embers, and waited in the bitter chill. The minutes dragged on torturously, every snapping twig or rustling branch jolting my heart. Eventually, I saw Dad glance at his watch, frowning deeply. "It's past 1, he whispered. Let's move. We hoisted our packs and took our first cautious steps away from camp, barely daring to breathe. The forest around us felt suffocating, every shadow hiding unseen threats. We'd made it maybe 50 yards, following our carefully marked GPS route through dense trees when a sharp crack echoed from behind. An instant later, a bright orange flash erupted in the darkness, briefly illuminating the trees like a violent sunrise. We both spun around, our eyes widening in horror as a figure emerged through the flames, briefly silhouetted by the flickering blaze. My heart lurched. It was impossibly tall and emaciated, with elongated limbs and pale, ash-covered skin that stretched over prominent bones. Its jaw hung grotesquely wide, an open maw of blackness. And even in that split-second glimpse, I could tell there were no eyes, only empty hollows. "Run!" Dad shouted, grabbing my arm and yanking me forward. Adrenaline surged through me, obliterating the pain in my legs as we plunged into a panicked sprint. Branches clawed at my face and neck. I stumbled repeatedly, nearly losing my footing on slick rocks and tangled undergrowth. Dad's breathing was harsh beside me, matching mine in sheer desperation. Behind us, crashing steps echoed relentlessly, heavy and deliberate, drawing closer with every stride. I slipped hard, my knees slamming onto shale, sending sharp pain slicing upward through my body. Dad hauled me up without pause, his grip iron tight. We pushed forward blindly, driven by fear and instinct alone. Then the whistles started, sharp, shrill sounds piercing the night. They echoed strangely, distorted, almost mimicking human voices, but twisted into something far worse. It felt as though they came from every direction at once, impossible to pinpoint. My throat tightened in panic. The trail blurred ahead, lit dimly by our shaking headlamps. The figure behind us crashed through brush and branches, persistent but strangely measured, matching our frantic pace as if it were playing a twisted game. My lungs burned, each breath ragged, every step becoming heavier and slower. Still, Dad pushed us forward, unwilling to slow down. Just as the sky began to lighten, faint hints of dawn illuminating the peaks around us, the terrain leveled out. A surge of hope jolted me. We were close to the parking area, our truck parked safely just beyond this final stretch of wilderness. "Dad," I gasped, my voice raw from exertion. "We're almost there." We stumbled together, our pace frantic and uneven, desperate to reach the dirt lot ahead. Behind us, the creature's pursuit had slowed, the whistles fading to silence, replaced only by distant, eerie cracking sounds. Neither of us dared to look back. Finally, our boots met, packed dirt, familiar ground beneath us at last. We reached the truck in seconds, our hands shaking violently as Dad fumbled with the keys, finally unlocking the doors. I practically threw myself inside, my chest heaving painfully. Dad started the engine immediately, spinning gravel as we pulled away, racing down the narrow road. Neither of us spoke during the drive back towards civilization. Exhaustion seeped into my bones, and I stared out the passenger window, seeing nothing but dark trees and shadowed mountains. When we reached the ranger station an hour later, the sun was fully risen, bathing the world in an oddly normal light that felt surreal. The rangers listened carefully to Dad's recounting, disbelief and concern mixing on their faces. 2 days later, a search team returned to the coordinates we provided. Dad and I waited in anxious silence for their report. But what they found offered no relief, only further confusion. The entire ridge had been burned black. Charred trees and scorched rocks stretched as far as they could see. The strange bone and wood shelter, the boots, the signs of whatever had stalked us, nothing remained. Not a single piece of evidence survived the flames. We never returned to the Wind River Range. Dad stopped guiding trips, retreating further into himself. He began writing letters, quiet apologies to the families of those lost men from his old unit. He never shared their replies, if there ever were any. Years later, I framed that army patch, sealing it carefully beneath glass. Below it, in small, precise handwriting, I noted the GPS coordinates we'd marked. Blood Ridge, a place now wiped from official maps, existing only in our memories and nightmares. Story 3. I've always been aware of the reputation of Snowshoe Gulch. It's a common trait for most trails in the Flathead National Forest, especially if you talk to the local hunters, fishermen, and guides who have spent their lives in these mountains. Growing up, I'd heard quiet warnings and whispers about places that just didn't feel right. My brother Eli and I would sometimes joke about the strange stories, calling them campfire talk or old-timer paranoia. But we never laughed too loud. We always watched the tree line carefully when the shadows began to stretch. When Eli and his client Eric Halstead disappeared in early January 2019, those old whispers returned, louder and more chilling than before. 3 days after they didn't come back, Flathead County Search and Rescue began combing the trails, trying to find their tracks. I chose not to join the main group despite their request. Instead, I partnered with Nathan Two Feathers, a Blackfeet tracker I'd known since we were kids. We were also joined by 2 other volunteers, Deputy Greg Weller from the Sheriff's Department and a local named Jesse, who had been snowmobiling in these forests almost as long as I had. We left before sunrise, our snowmobile engines cutting through the quiet morning. Headlights pierced the heavy snow flurries as we rolled over the mountains. After 3 hours of riding, we reached the edge of Snowshoe Gulch. It was a place not meant for snowmobiling, being too steep, too narrow, and notoriously unpredictable. However, Eli's GPS had pinged nearby before falling silent. Ahead of me, Nathan slowed and signaled for us to stop. His expression was grim beneath the fur-lined hood of his parka. "This place feels wrong," he said, killing his engine. He gazed through the trees, his eyes narrowed. "My grandfather refused to hunt here," he said. "He called it a place the forest wouldn't take back." Greg gave a nervous chuckle, attempting to lighten the mood. "Come on, Two Feathers. Let's not spook ourselves before we even get started." Nathan ignored him and looked directly at me. "Caleb, if your brother came here willingly, he had a good reason. Eli was smart." I nodded silently. Eli was experienced and careful. If he had come here, something must have drawn him. We rode slowly into the gulch, our engines rumbling as we navigated around fallen trees and snowdrifts higher than our waists. The deeper we went, the quieter everything became. There was no bird song, no rustling of branches, just an oppressive, thick silence. Jesse was the first to spot the sleds, pointing wordlessly. They were sitting in a small clearing, arranged nose to nose in a perfect circle. Their headlights were still faintly glowing under the snow drifts. "Why would they park like that?" Jesse whispered, a hint of unease in his voice. I moved closer, brushing snow from the seat of Eli's sled. His keys were still in the ignition and the fuel gauge read half full. It didn't make sense. Eli was meticulous and disciplined. He wouldn't abandon his machine in such a strange way. Nathan crouched by the tracks, leading away from the snowmobiles. "2 sets of prints," he said. "No panic, no running, they walked." We followed the footprints carefully through the snow until they abruptly ended at a frozen creek. Greg stepped cautiously onto the ice, shining his flashlight through the layers. "Solid, thick," he said. "No cracks, no signs of someone breaking through." Greg muttered, "Impossible." Disbelief colored his voice as he said, "Tracks don't just disappear." Nathan stood quietly, studying the trees above the creek, his breath clouded in the fading daylight. "Something erased them," Nathan said, "and this place doesn't belong to us. It never did." The sun sank behind the ridgeline, bringing swift darkness. We set up camp on a flat rise overlooking the clearing. We lit a fire that crackled softly against the suffocating stillness of the forest. Nathan silently scattered tobacco to the 4 directions around our camp. Greg watched skeptically, his mouth forming questions he never asked. Jesse paced restlessly near the fire, constantly glancing toward the shadows. After the others had gone to bed, I sat awake, staring into the dark trees. Somewhere out there was Eli. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us. I glanced at Nathan, who hadn't moved from his spot by the fire. I moved closer and whispered, "What did your grandfather say lived out here?" Nathan didn't look at me, just gazed unblinking into the flames. "He called it the Eater of Men," Nathan said. "Old, hungry, something from the times when these mountains belonged to no tribe. He said, it sleeps until someone wakes it." I shivered despite the fire's heat. Before I could reply, Jesse jerked awake nearby, his eyes wide with panic. He scrambled backward, pointing frantically toward the trees behind me. "I saw someone," Jesse gasped, his voice shaking. "Someone tall walking out there behind the trees." We grabbed flashlights and weapons, immediately scanning the darkness beyond the camp's glow. We saw nothing. No tracks, no movement, only endless shadows cast by trees and snow. "You imagined it," Greg grumbled, clearly irritated but uncertain. But Jesse shook his head firmly, retreating closer to the fire. "I know what I saw," he insisted. Nathan watched silently, his jaw tense. Then he slowly turned back toward the fire. "Sleep if you can," he said. "Tomorrow will be harder." I tried to rest, but sleep wouldn't come. Each rustle of the branches made my heart leap. Every shadow became something standing there watching. I lay awake, eyes open, waiting for morning, knowing in my gut that whatever was out here was waiting, too. Morning broke gray and bitter. A low-hanging mist shrouded Snowshoe Gulch like a damp cloak. Sleep had eluded me, coming only in restless bursts. I woke exhausted, with Nathan already methodically packing gear. Greg stood nearby, pacing impatiently, glancing between his watch and the silent trees. Jesse sat close to the dying embers of our fire, staring blankly into the snow. I pulled my coat tighter, ignoring the knot of dread in my stomach. We ate quickly and mostly in silence, our conversation limited to planning. Nathan stood, shouldered his pack, and spoke quietly. "We follow the tracks as far as they lead," he said. "Then we reconsider. Everyone stays within eyesight." We retraced our steps back to the frozen creek. The footprints remained exactly as we had left them, vanishing inexplicably at the icy edge. Nathan knelt again, brushing away fresh snow with a gloved hand. "This wasn't natural," he muttered softly, barely loud enough for me to hear. Greg cleared his throat impatiently, eager to dismiss Nathan's superstitions. "Then let's find what did it and be done," he said. "We're wasting daylight." Nathan said nothing, rising slowly, his eyes scanning the ridge ahead. With no clear trail, we climbed the steep incline, picking our way through tangled brush and dense pines. Snow crunched beneath our boots, echoing oddly through the silent woods. The farther we ascended, the more oppressive the quiet became, pressing down around us. Halfway up, Jesse stopped abruptly, his voice trembling. "What the hell is that?" he asked. We turned, following his gaze upward. About 20 feet above us, wedged firmly into the trunk of a towering pine, was the partially eaten skull of a deer. Its jaw hung crookedly and its empty eye socket stared down at us, grotesque and hollow. I felt bile rise in my throat. "Who could do that?" Jesse whispered. Greg stepped forward, examining it closer. His face was a mixture of disgust and confusion. "No blood, no drag marks," Greg said. "This doesn't make sense." Nathan was staring at the trees around us, his eyes wide and alert. He motioned for silence, pointing to something further ahead. We moved cautiously, our eyes searching through the gloom. A dozen yards up, we saw more. Limbs of animals, antlers, and deer legs were wedged between branches, arranged deliberately high above the ground. Everything appeared drained, dried, almost mummified. I glanced at Nathan, whose face had turned pale. He shook his head slowly, his voice tight. "This is a warning," he said. "It wants us gone." Greg snorted angrily, visibly shaken. "This is just some sick local playing games." Nathan met his eyes without blinking. "No man did this." Silence hung heavy between us. Finally, Nathan spoke, his voice firm but quiet. "I will go no further," he said. "Whatever woke up in this place is older than us. We have intruded enough." I stared at him, anger and fear warring inside me. "My brother's still out here, Nathan," I said. "I'm not leaving until we find him." Nathan's eyes softened briefly, sympathy in his gaze. "I won't risk all of our lives," he said. "Not for this." Greg set his jaw defiantly. "Then stay here," he said. "Caleb and I will finish this." I nodded, though my pulse was pounding in my ears. Jesse looked back and forth uncertainly, then quietly took a step toward Nathan. "I'll stay too," he said, avoiding my gaze. I can't." Without another word, Greg and I pressed upward. The air seemed to grow colder, biting through my clothing. My fingers tightened on the handle of my flashlight, knuckles aching from the grip. After a few exhausting minutes, we reached the crest of the ridge. Greg stopped suddenly, his eyes wide, his face drained of color. "Caleb," he whispered hoarsely. Ahead of us, barely visible in the snowdrift, was a dark shape, a sleeve, a bright orange parka sleeve. My heart seized painfully as we scrambled forward, frantically digging. Eric Holstead's frozen face emerged, rigid and twisted into a final grimace of terror. His body was curled in a tight fetal position. Both his feet were bare and blackened with frostbite. His eyes stared sightlessly at the sky. "Jesus," Greg breathed, stepping back, horror evident on his face. "What happened to him?" he asked. I stood numb, unable to tear my gaze from the expression of pure dread locked onto Eric's face. A sudden snapping sound echoed through the trees behind us, making us both spin around. Greg raised his rifle, his flashlight beam slicing through the thickening gloom. The woods were empty, yet I could feel something there. Something heavy and unseen, breathing slowly, patiently. The hairs on my neck rose as silence reclaimed the forest. "Let's get him back," I finally whispered. We carried Eric down awkwardly, our breath misting the air in hurried bursts. Every step felt heavier than the last. Nathan and Jesse met us halfway, their expressions grim. Nathan's eyes never left Eric's body. "Leave him here," Nathan said, his voice flat. Greg bristled, furious. "Like hell we will," he said. Nathan didn't flinch or move. "Don't bring the marked one to the fire, it knows." Greg cursed bitterly, but I waved him silent. "We'll bury him nearby then," I said quietly, ignoring the nausea rising in my throat. We dug hurriedly, placing Eric carefully in the shallow grave and covering him swiftly with frozen earth and snow. All the while, Nathan stood watching the darkening woods, his lips moving softly in prayer. That night, around our fire, we barely spoke. Greg stared angrily into the darkness, gripping his rifle tightly. Jesse curled up near the fire, his eyes wide with terror, flinching at every sound. Nathan remained silent, his gaze fixed on the tree line. As exhaustion finally pulled at me, I heard it. A slow, heavy crunching through the snow, circling our camp just beyond the reach of the firelight. Each footfall was deliberate, patient, and close. When I lifted my head to look, nothing moved. Yet the sound continued, circling endlessly, never quite seen. I shut my eyes, unable to block it out. As sleep claimed me, one thought echoed relentlessly in my mind. We were never alone out here. I woke to an ashen dawn, frost biting sharply at my exposed skin. The fire had burned down to embers, leaving the campsite gray and lifeless. I sat up stiffly, my body sore and my mind still haunted by the heavy footsteps I'd heard circling our camp through the night. Across from me, Nathan was already awake, silently sharpening a knife, his eyes distant and troubled. I stood, stretching out the ache in my limbs, scanning the surroundings. Jesse was pacing nervously, his head bowed, his hands trembling. Greg loaded his rifle carefully, his jaw set tight with grim determination. Nathan finally spoke, his eyes meeting mine briefly before turning back to his blade. "We need to leave," he said. "There's nothing left here we can save." "My brother's still out there, Nathan," I said, my voice rough from the cold. "I won't leave him." Nathan sighed heavily, setting his knife down. He stood slowly, meeting my eyes. "Caleb, your brother isn't here anymore," he said. "Not the way you remember him. This place doesn't return what it takes." Greg interrupted sharply, stepping forward. "Enough with this superstition," he said. "We saw Eric's body. There's still hope Eli is alive out here." Nathan's eyes darkened. "What's alive out here isn't Eli anymore," he said. I hesitated, uncertainty tightening my throat. Then Greg touched my shoulder, his voice firm and reassuring. "We came here to find him," he said. "Let's finish it." I nodded slowly, pushing away Nathan's warning, and adjusted my pack. Jesse shook his head quickly, backing toward Nathan. I'm staying here," he said. "I can't go back up there." Nathan placed a reassuring hand on Jesse's shoulder, watching Greg and me prepare to leave. As we moved into the trees, Nathan called softly, his voice carrying clearly in the silence. "If you see it, don't run," he said. "Don't look it in the eyes." The climb back to the ridge was grueling. Silence stretched between us, broken only by the sound of our breathing. Greg led, his rifle clenched tightly in his gloved hands. My thoughts spiraled, fear gnawing at the edges of my resolve. As we crested the ridge, we froze. The trees here had changed overnight. Branches were snapped cleanly and arranged in a crude circle, limbs twisted like grotesque sculptures. In the snow, clearly visible, were Eli's boot prints leading deeper into the woods. My pulse quickened. Hope and dread tangled painfully together. Greg stepped forward, cautiously examining the tracks. "These are fresh," he said softly, motioning me onward. We followed slowly, scanning every shadow, each breath tense and shallow. The prints wound deeper into the forest, disappearing behind a dense wall of tangled pines. Then, from just beyond those trees, came Eli's voice, thin, hollow, and unmistakable. "Caleb, is that you?" he asked. I broke forward without thinking, desperation propelling me past Greg. He called out sharply behind me, but I didn't slow. I pushed through the dense branches, emerging into a small clearing. Eli stood at the far end, barefoot in the snow, his eyes glazed and his lips cracked. His parka was torn from his shoulders, and his skin was pale and blue beneath. He trembled violently, staring blankly through me. "Eli," I said, my breath hitching, "we're here. We found you." He didn't move or acknowledge my words. Instead, his eyes widened, focused beyond me, terror flooding his features. A guttural roar erupted from the trees behind us, echoing painfully through the clearing. Greg spun around, his rifle raised, shouting. I grabbed Eli's arm, pulling him toward me, panic surging in my chest. "Run!" Greg shouted, firing blindly into the trees. His shots echoed uselessly, swallowed by the forest. I pulled Eli forward, stumbling through the snow, my heart hammering wildly. Behind me, I heard Greg scream, a raw, agonized sound abruptly silenced. I didn't turn back. We burst through the trees, slipping and falling toward Nathan and Jesse's waiting forms below. Nathan rushed to meet us, his eyes wide with urgency. "Keep moving," he shouted, gripping Eli's other arm. pulling us down toward the camp. Behind us, branches snapped violently. Something massive was pursuing us unseen, its pace steady and relentless. My lungs burned as we scrambled to the snowmobiles. Jesse started the engines frantically, terror etched on his face. Nathan shoved Eli onto the sled behind Jesse, then turned sharply toward the trees, chanting urgently under his breath. Then he pushed me toward the sled, his eyes fierce and clear. "Go!" he commanded. The engines roared to life, drowning out the deafening silence of the forest. I hesitated for only a second before climbing on, glancing back just long enough to see Nathan facing the trees defiantly, his lips moving and his knife drawn. Then we were speeding away, the gulch disappearing behind us in a blur of white and shadow. We rode hard, not slowing until we reached open ground near the main trails. Only then did Jesse finally kill the engine. I slid off, my legs shaking, and turned to Eli. He sat motionless, his eyes distant, murmuring softly to himself. Jesse stood back, breathing heavily, pale and shaken. In that quiet moment, Eli's whispers became clear. "It watches through the bones. It watches through the bones." 2 days later, Eli was found wandering barefoot down an old logging road miles from Snowshoe Gulch. He remembered nothing, offering only fractured whispers about the Tall One and the Eater of Men. Greg's body was never recovered. Weeks passed before I visited Eli in the psychiatric facility in Kalispell. He refused to go near windows at night, his eyes always fixed fearfully on shadows. As I prepared to leave, he finally spoke clearly, his voice strained and hollow. "You can't see it unless it wants you to, but you feel it," he said. "It waits behind the cold." I left him there, haunted by his words and the knowledge that whatever we had awakened out in Snowshoe Gulch still lingered, patient and hungry, waiting silently behind the trees. Story 4. The Lake of the Woods had always been a sanctuary for me, a sprawling maze of ice-covered water spanning the border between Minnesota and Ontario. I'd fished here every winter for over 35 years, sometimes with my wife, but mostly alone. She had preferred summers at the cabin nearby G. Everything changed when cancer took her last July. This winter, more than ever, I needed the solitude. I needed to disappear for a while, to lose myself in the stillness of ice fishing and silence. I loaded my sled and snowmobile at first light, packing carefully. Ice auger, propane heater, cot, lantern, canned food, water, and extra fuel. As I drove deeper onto the frozen expanse toward the isolated chain of islets known as Devil's Elbow, the morning sun cast a pale glow over the ice, turning the world silver and ghostly. It was miles from the resorts and the crowds, perfect isolation, just as I had planned. The ride was familiar. I knew every bend, every cluster of pines, and every patch of rough ice. I stopped near the southern tip of the largest island, checking the ice thickness with practiced caution. It was 18 inches, more than enough. Within minutes, I had drilled a hole and set up the shack around it. The wind broke against the heavy canvas walls as I lit my heater and settled in. For the first time in months, I felt truly alone, but it was a comforting loneliness. The first night passed quietly. I had dinner from a warmed can, coffee brewed in a dented kettle, and a dog-eared paperback to occupy my mind before I slept on the narrow cot. Dreams came easy, which was a rare thing these days, and I woke at sunrise feeling better than I had in months. After breakfast, I ventured north on the snowmobile to visit an old shack belonging to a friend, Jim Barrett, who had long since moved south for better winters. I hadn't expected anyone to be around, and sure enough, the shack was deserted and neatly locked up. On impulse, I drilled a quick test hole nearby and was rewarded immediately with 2 good-sized walleye. Satisfied, I mentally marked the spot, planning to return again. By late afternoon, clouds had gathered, dimming the sun to a thin yellow smudge on the horizon. The temperature dropped sharply, sending bitter gusts across the open ice. I hurried back to my shack, the hum of the snowmobile engine fading into a deafening silence as I parked it close to the canvas walls. Inside, I cooked dinner and readied myself for another long, quiet evening. Sleep took hold quickly again, but sometime late in the night, I jerked awake. A noise had disturbed me. I sat up on my cot, listening intently, breathing shallowly. It came again, a slow, measured crunch. Footsteps were steadily approaching over the ice. I froze, my heart hammering. My lantern had gone out, and the shack was dark except for the moonlight filtering weakly through the frosted canvas. The crunching continued, methodical and unhurried, circling the shack. I gripped the edge of the cot, listening for any sign of human presence. A voice, breathing, anything, but there was none. Only heavy footsteps. Carefully, I eased toward the small window slit and peered through a gap in the frost. The ice outside was empty. Moonlight washed the surface white, but no silhouette broke the desolation. Still, the footsteps continued around me, slowly circling, sometimes stopping abruptly, then starting again, each step hollow and impossibly heavy. I held still, not daring to breathe deeply, every muscle rigid. After what felt like hours, but might have only been minutes, the footsteps moved away, fading into silence. I didn't sleep again. I waited, listening until dawn. When the sky finally paled, I found the courage to unzip the shack and step cautiously outside. Cold air bit at my face. The ice spread pristine and empty in every direction. But as I circled around my shack, my stomach tightened. Clear footprints, large and bare, had pressed deeply into the snow and ice, looping in an even circle around the shack. What chilled me to the bone wasn't the size or shape of the prints, though they were disturbingly large and elongated. It was that they started suddenly midway across the ice with no trail leading up to them and ended just as abruptly a few yards away. Whatever had visited me hadn't walked in or walked away. It had simply appeared and vanished, leaving nothing but footprints and silence. Morning broke heavy and gray, shrouding the lake in thick drifting fog that seemed to swallow the distant islands entirely. I stood for a long while in front of the shack, staring at those unnatural footprints in disbelief. There was no logical explanation, nothing in all my years of fishing and hunting this land that could make sense of it. I shook off the thoughts and tried to steady myself by returning to my routine. I reached for the radio, calling out on the local channel. "Anybody copy? It's Tom Braydock out near Devil's Elbow. Thinking of heading in early. Anyone around?" Only static replied. That wasn't unusual this far out, but today it felt oppressive. My cell phone was useless. I had no reception bars to anchor me to civilization. I was completely alone, and for the first time in decades, that truth unsettled me. I ate a small breakfast of cold jerky and stale crackers, glancing out at the icy surface of the lake, now blanketed by a fresh dusting of snow. The memories from the night lingered in the forefront of my mind, too real to dismiss. Determined to distract myself, I climbed onto my snowmobile and decided to return to Jim Barrett's old shack. Perhaps there'd be something there, some overlooked clue, something familiar to help settle the twisting unease in my gut. The ride was short but tense, my eyes constantly darting toward the islands and the tree line, expecting movement that never came. I arrived quickly, but as soon as the shack came into view, dread rose sharply inside me. Something had changed. I parked and stepped off the snowmobile slowly, cautiously. The front wall of Jim's shack was ripped outward. The thick plywood splintered as though it had exploded from within. My pulse quickened. I approached slowly, my boots crunching quietly through fresh snow, my breath fogging in the bitter air. Inside was chaos. The cot Jim had left folded neatly in the corner was shattered, its canvas shredded into ragged ribbons. Blood, dark and frozen, stained the floorboards and pooled in the corner, spreading outward toward the door. Despite the violence evident everywhere, none of the gear had been disturbed. Jim's tackle box sat untouched, and his propane heater and lantern were neatly stacked as if nothing had happened. There was no body, no trail, just blood. It was too much blood for a man to have left behind and still walk away. I backed out quickly, feeling dizzy. The forested islands now seemed to press closer, dark shapes looming silently at the edge of my vision. Panic tightened my throat as I mounted the snowmobile and drove back toward my shack, forcing myself not to glance back at the devastation I'd found. Thoughts raced frantically. An animal attack. Perhaps a bear waking early from hibernation, or maybe someone dangerous who had been hidden out there. But none of these explanations could silence the fear rising sharply inside me. Back at my own shack, I hurried to pack my gear, shoving items quickly and haphazardly into the sled. But as I worked, a sinking realization crept over me. The sun was already dipping toward the horizon, shadows stretching long across the ice. If I tried leaving now, the slush patches forming under the snowpack could trap me miles from shore, leaving me helplessly stranded in the darkness. After a desperate internal debate, I decided my safest move was to wait until first light. Night fell quickly, darker than I remembered ever seeing it. I sat silently on my cot, my flare gun clutched tightly, staring at the canvas walls as the wind whispered around the shack. It wasn't long after darkness settled completely that I heard the sound. A hollow, mournful howl that seemed to carry impossibly far across the frozen lake. It wasn't the howl of a wolf or the call of any animal I'd heard in my long life. The sound seeped through the shack walls, reverberating through my bones, primal and wrong. My hands shook as I rose carefully and peeked through the narrow window slit toward the nearest island, scarcely visible in the dim starlight. A dark shape stood just within the tree line, tall, gaunt, and unnaturally still. It stood straight and motionless, staring directly across the ice toward my shack. I strained my eyes, searching for details, but darkness swallowed them. The figure remained perfectly motionless, waiting, watching. I lowered myself slowly onto the cot, barely breathing, my muscles rigid with fear. Seconds turned into minutes, each stretching painfully, tension building like pressure beneath thin ice. Suddenly, footsteps approached, again crunching slowly toward me. I clenched the flare gun tighter, my finger trembling against the trigger. Then came the soft tap. One single knock against the canvas wall behind me, clear and unmistakable. My chest tightened, my heart racing wildly. Silence followed, thick, absolute smothering. I waited motionless for another sound, but nothing followed. The shack became unbearably still. The only sound was my ragged breath. Sleep eventually claimed me, though I fought it desperately, terrified by what lay just beyond the thin walls that separated me from whatever lurked in the frozen darkness. And as I drifted off, I knew beyond doubt that it would return before morning. I jerked awake at first light, startled by the sharp cold biting my skin. My breath clouded heavily inside the shack, and a thin layer of frost had formed along the walls overnight. Everything felt dangerously still, as though the lake itself had frozen solid in its sleep. The memory of last night's tapping resurfaced quickly, making my pulse quicken. I forced myself upright, aching and stiff from tension, and began hastily gathering my belongings. Ignoring organization, I threw my gear into the sled, cot, heater, supplies, all jammed together. I was past caring about broken equipment. Panic was taking hold, compelling me toward only one goal: escape. My hands shook as I secured the last tie down and glanced nervously across the ice toward the tree line. No movement disturbed the silent pines, but the feeling of being watched never left. As I climbed onto the snowmobile, the motor fired to life instantly, its growl breaking the heavy silence. I glanced behind me once more, expecting to see the dark figure emerging from the trees, but saw nothing. Gritting my teeth, I opened the throttle wide, accelerating quickly across the open ice toward the ranger outpost 12 miles away. For a few minutes, I let relief creep into my thoughts, feeling my muscles loosen. I was getting away. It was going to be all right. But then something in the side mirror caught my eye, snapping me back into full alertness. A shape moved behind me, dark against the white expanse of ice, impossibly fast. My chest tightened, and my breath came sharply. I risked a quick look over my shoulder. What I saw sent raw panic surging through me. A gaunt figure pursued me relentlessly, running upright in an unnatural, jerking motion. It moved too fast, bounding forward in massive strides, its long arms swinging low beside its emaciated body. Its skin was pale and leathery, almost gray, stretched tightly over prominent ribs and sharp joints. Even from this distance, its eyes burned bright and hollow. Desperation gripped me, and I pressed the throttle harder. My snowmobile surged forward, its engine whining in protest. The figure behind me let out a strange guttural cry, a sound somewhere between choking and rage. The ice ahead looked fragile now, riddled with pockets of slush and dark water seeping through cracks. I knew I was pushing the limit, but slowing down wasn't an option. Glancing back again, the creature had closed the gap terrifyingly fast. In a frantic bid to buy myself time, I grabbed the flare gun from my coat pocket, aimed shakily upward, and fired. The flare rocketed into the gray sky, exploding in a bright burst that momentarily distracted the pursuing figure. It paused briefly, shielding its face from the sudden blaze, and I gained precious distance. Just as I felt a glimmer of hope, the snowmobile lurched violently, its skis plunging into a slush pocket hidden beneath fresh snow. The machine stopped abruptly, pitching me forward. Ice cracked loudly beneath me, water rushing into the newly opened hole, pulling the snowmobile under with alarming speed. I scrambled desperately, icy water flooding around my knees and soaking through my clothes instantly. The shoreline stood less than 30 yards ahead. Crawling forward, my fingers digging painfully into the frozen slush, I dragged myself from the widening hole, ice splintering loudly beneath my weight. Behind me, footsteps thudded steadily closer. The adrenaline forced me upright, and I staggered towards solid ground. My legs numb, my lungs burning with every painful breath. The growling, choking sound of the creature echoed closer, closing rapidly. I refused to turn, knowing that seeing it clearly would rob me of any strength left. Reaching the shoreline felt surreal. I collapsed heavily onto solid snow just as the ice behind me shattered, splashing violently as something crashed through, shrieking furiously. Unable to move, I lay gasping in the snow, trembling uncontrollably, certain I was moments from being dragged back. But the attack never came. Instead, a different sound reached me. An approaching vehicle. A game warden's ATV appeared on the nearby service trail, drawn by the flare. He jumped out, his eyes wide in shock, and helped me onto the back of his vehicle. He wrapped an emergency blanket around me, asking questions I could barely answer. 2 days later, after warming up and recovering at the ranger station, I returned to the spot with the local authorities. The ice had refrozen overnight, erasing all evidence of my near drowning, except for long claw marks etched deeply into the fresh ice, tracing away from the hole. There was no blood, no animal tracks, no obvious explanation for what had pursued me. Just those marks, impossibly deep and spaced too far apart for any animal I knew. I never returned to Lake of the Woods. I sold everything. The shack, the gear, the snowmobile. Yet as much as I've tried to forget, the memory refuses to fade. I told my story once to the Ontario Ministry of Natural Resources. They recorded it, but the tape quickly vanished. Officially, the incident was labeled an animal attack and dismissed. Yet every winter I hear stories whispered by the locals of fishermen going missing out near Devil's Elbow, leaving only abandoned gear, blood-stained ice, and deep and impossible footprints leading nowhere. That concludes our episode for today. We hope these stories left a lasting impression and made you look at the wilderness from a different perspective. If you want to keep exploring a world of mystery where reality intertwines with the unexplainable, show your support by hitting like and subscribing. This will help the YouTube algorithm suggest more of this content to you, and you won't miss a single new episode. Until next time, take care of yourself and your loved ones. And remember, some mysteries are better left unsolved. Goodbye.